So my name is Rebecca, and I'm a psychologist. I direct Mindwell Psychology's Bethesda office. I am also a mother and a stepmother, 2 little boys that I made on my own, and my stepson's 21. Before becoming a psychologist, I was a special education teacher for Montgomery County and a couple special education schools as well. So, when we do this, the research suggests that if you're having a good time, your amygdala is going to tag your memories of this event as positive. You're more likely to remember it. You'd also be more likely to remember it if I scared the heck out of you. We're going to go with the trying to have a good time. So we're going to joke around a lot, and there's some slides that are intended to be funny and such. The one thing that I'm never joking about or I'm never kidding about is the rights of our kids to be treated with dignity, the rights of parents to be treated with dignity, and the rights of kids who have learning differences and special needs. So there's the joking, but then there's the serious side. Okay. So generally when people come to see me, I do neuropsychological testing and some therapy, and the questions are like this. So they're related to specific tasks. And when we think about behaviorism and behavior plans, BIPs and FIPs and FBAs and all of that, generally we're talking about eliciting task-specific behavior. Turning off the phone, picking up your dirty socks, putting the lid down on the toilet seat if you're boys, like I do. But these questions aren't actually all that helpful to us when we're thinking about the bigger issue. So we want to be a little more like Yoda. I put Yoda in every one of my presentations because I love Star Wars, but also because he's the canonical example of like the wise teacher. So the real questions we need to ask are bigger questions than just how do I get my kid to pick up his socks? Or how do I get her to study her spelling words? So the real questions are things like, how do I teach perseverance, self-motivation? How do I get this kid to feel confident enough? When I come here to McLean, they often talk about the wounded ducks, the kids who come in and they've been beaten down and discouraged and they're sad and they're feeling kind of ashamed of themselves. And how do we turn that around? So they know at McLean, we're going to talk about what we can do as parents at home. Being a trained special educator, I have to give you an advance organizer. Where are we headed? What are we going to cover today? There's a little path. So we'll start off with some biology. Hopefully nobody's eyes are going to glaze over. But I find that if you understand a little bit how the brain works, then you have a better sense of insight about what your kids are doing and why. We'll talk about the psychology of motivation, and we're going to spend most of our time on the practical piece. Okay, Rebecca, I looked at your slides about brains. Come on, get to the part where we get my son to study his spelling words. And so we'll get there. And then how do we help our kids develop that internalized sense of motivation? Okay, so lots of brain slides. Motivation arises from communication across brain areas. You all have been to all these talks. The psychologists always put up the brain slides. Maybe we do that because we feel like it will make us look smart. That's probably why. But I think it is actually useful. And so what everybody learned was that there's the old brain in the middle. You all seen this where everybody says, now make a fist. The brain matures from the inside out, from back to front, from right to left. Front part of your brain, right back here behind your eyes, prefrontal, or a little higher. Your prefrontal cortex doesn't mature until you're about 25, which is Bill noted as the age when you can rent a car and get a hotel room. But it's not like we have sections of our brain, like this section does this section does that. The brain is more like superhighway, full of loops and circuits and pathways. So there's constant feedback from these deep, deep structures in our brain. Oh, there's my shadow. What we call the limbic system is down in that blue area. And the limbic system is processing emotion. So when Bill talked about the amygdala, you get these little almond-shaped things deep in your brain called your amygdala. And your amygdala will respond to threats. If right now I throw a Molotov cocktail at you all, your amygdala, your whole stress response will start. You get that nice fight or flight reaction. But the amygdala is not just about getting scared if a snake pops out at you. The amygdala is also about tagging memories. So the amygdala attaches a little tag. I'm so sorry, cameraman, I'm really challenging you today.
No.
So your amygdala attaches a tag to information that comes through. Either this is positive or this is negative. And what it does then is it's really important to know whether something was a good or bad experience. So your amygdala then communicates with your hippocampus, the memory center. Because our brain is always trying to get a sense of, well, what was good, what was bad, how do we get more of the good, how do we avoid the bad? So when we think about our kids and learning, it's really important to understand that emotion has a lot to do with how our kids learn and with how motivated they are to do the stuff that we want them to do. One of the other things to talk about the brain is that our brains are designed to be very efficient. We're born with way more neurons than we'll ever need. And the process of learning in childhood, it sounds appealing to think of it in terms of, oh, we're building more neurons, we're growing neurons. No, we're killing off neurons. We're doing a lot of connectivity, and so we're connecting neurons. But the brain is constantly figuring out, I don't need this, and getting rid of it. And the things that we're stimulated to do over and over again, like say learning to read, those are the things where the brain is going to build up those connections and make efficient pathways. So there's a saying about the brain, neurons that fire together, wire together. So if you get enough of a certain type of stimulation, say playing the violin, your brain's going to actually change. Learning to read changes our brain and how it works. So we're literally, when we're teaching our children, we're sculpting their brains. But in terms of how the brain works, the brain doesn't want to work that hard. The brain is a very expensive organ for our body. It's like this big glob of fat, takes a lot of glucose, takes a lot of oxygen, takes a lot of blood. So what our brain's always trying to do is get leaner and meaner and more efficient. So when anybody came today, nobody went around to the back of the school if they parked in the front parking lot, right? Why would you do that? As we get to this point in our lives, where all of us are dyeing our roots on a regular basis, when we get to this point, we're getting very efficient at most of the things that we do every day. You know, when you first had a baby, you were like, oh my God, I'm gonna get this diaper on, he's squirming. How do we get it on before I get my whole shirt wet? And then after a while, you're just, you're talking on the phone, you're stirring the soup, everything else. So by the time we get to this point, most of what we're doing is the stuff that our insular cortex has taken over, the things that we've practiced and we can do them in our sleep, like Bill talked about when we're driving. If you hadn't been to this school before, then driving, your brain would have been activating the dorsolateral cortex, where you would have been, okay, where the heck is Deborah Road? What kind of Deborah? Is that really a road? Lochinver? How do you spell that? But for those of you who come here every day, I was just like, yeah, what's on NPR? Is that Katy Perry song on? So the brain really wants to not have to do a lot of extra work. And so we're kind of pre-programmed to do things as efficiently as possible, little heuristics. And so what we have to kind of help our kids do is overcome that. So if you think about the difference in our lives, where most of the stuff we can do on autopilot, we're good at our jobs, we're very comfortable in our roles, versus what our kids have to do, it's kind of all new and it's all pretty exhausting, and the brain is working so much harder than our middle-aged brains. And so when we think about the brain, we don't just think of like chunks of it. It's infinitesimally more complicated than that. So we got circuits, and I'm ripping off Steven Pinker's jokes. If you've ever read Steven Pinker or seen him speak, he's really funny, so steal from the best. The brain's designed to accomplish the 4 Fs, so feeding, fighting, fleeing, and finding true love. But we know there's so much more than that. I mean, obviously we're not all just sitting around cramming as many donuts as possible into our face or doing any of those other pleasurable things. I mean, we all got out of our nice warm beds this morning, got out of our pajamas and came here on a cold morning. You know, you could have just as well snuck off and got a pedicure and nobody would ever know. So the question is, why are you here? What motivated you to come here? And when we think about the biological basis of motivation, we got 2 major systems. One of those major symptoms, there's a slip. One of those major symptoms is what we call the pleasure circuit. So when we anticipate a reward, Patricia, I'm going to give you a sticker if you sit down in your seat. Doesn't that sound great? When we anticipate a reward, this area of our brain is activated, what we call the medial forebrain bundle. It's actually like a superhighway that sends information all around about, hey, goodies are coming. Hey, we like this. Let's make sure to remember this so we can get more of this. And it's communicating not just with the areas that we associate with, like decision making, planning, task execution, rational thought. It's also communicating with those areas that are responsible for the emotional basis of our brain, the stuff way down in the middle, the blue section, our limbic system. Okay. Now there's a lot of differences in terms of what motivates people. And if you take a minute and think back to a time when you were not successful. There's probably one or two of you in the room like, I'm good at everything. My husband isn't here. So if you think about that time when you were maybe in school, your residency program, if you're in the service, your first year teaching, when you felt like, oh my God, I suck at this. This is humiliating and hard and awful, and I can't wait to be done with this. So for me, that was kind of basketball in gym class for obvious reasons. I couldn't wait to be done with basketball. But for some people, basketball was a reward, set off their reward center of the brain, love it, love it, love it. For me, the punishment center went off, because I know I'm terrible at that. And why do we have those differences? Why does one person love basketball? Why does one person want to sit and write poetry? Why do our kids want to play that stupid Wii system? I don't get this. But we're so different, and part of the reason that we're different is because our brains function differently with respect to how much of a reward do we detect. So dopamine is one of our neurotransmitters, sends messages between cells. And dopamine and epinephrine norepinephrine are what we call the catecholamines. And catecholamines have been implicated in ADHD. One of the things you might talk about with ADHD is that these kids have a diminished reward response. So Mary Ellen may work very well for a sticker, but let's say Sarah has ADHD. Sarah is probably not going to be able to sit still and do those 10 long division problems for a Pokemon sticker. So we have different responses. Some people are going to get that nice blast of dopamine that feels so great just sitting down and saying to themselves, I'm going to ace this test. Whereas other kids, they're not going to get that response. It's going to take a lot more for them to actually get excited about something. And that's what motivation's all about. Some of us are very easy to motivate. You know, you probably have one kid in your household who's easy to motivate, and then you have the other where it's like pulling teeth constantly. I know I do. These vary across individuals, so we all respond differently to the exact same set of stimulus. Now, there's things that are fairly universal. I mean, we all like yummy food to eat, and I have yet to meet a person who likes to put together IKEA furniture. We would all agree that's one of the levels of hell. But somewhere out there's an engineer who loves putting together IKEA furniture. And dopamine levels also vary at different ages. And we know that trying to get our teenagers motivated to do something is a very different process than trying to get our toddlers motivated to do something. Teenagers actually have lower levels of free dopamine in their brains. What does that mean? They're more easily bored. Bored, this is so lame. But you love that. No, it's boring, I don't want to do it. But what they do is they get a nice blast of dopamine whenever anything that they really like happens. So you ever have the experience with your teenager where you're like, come on, let's go out to eat. No, this is lame. I'm too tired. Can I just stay home? And then their friend calls and says, you know, hey, do you want to come over? And they're like, yes, I want to come over. They've gotten that big blast of dopamine. And so it's hard for us to reward them properly because there's stuff that they want that they can't have all the time, such as life. And here's punishment. Our paraventricular system. So this is basically sending a lot of information up to the cortex where we make decisions, all about, wow, I hate this, this is painful, this is uncomfortable, this is boring, hopefully not now. All of these things that happen to some of us, I'll give my example. I hated Algebra 2 almost more than life itself. Loved geometry, loved statistics. Hated Algebra 2 with a passion. You know, I was 16 years old. I didn't want to do it. So for me, set off the punishment circuit there. Different things are going to set that up for different people. So for example, give a dyslexic kid a Faulkner book. They're going to have that exact same response. It's really like you punish them. And it does set off the same kind of reaction. You know, like Bill said, the amygdala doesn't detect the difference between, you know, if I throw a snake at you, Tony, versus if you're dyslexic and I say, here's Grapes of Wrath. Read the first 5 chapters and be ready to talk about it tomorrow morning. It's all the same to your brain. So what we do, and what our kids do, is we learn to avoid that which gives us pain. Which do you think can override the other? The pleasure circuit of the brain or the punishment circuit of the brain? I think we all know, right? It's the punishment circuit of the brain. There's this wonderful psychologist, I think he was a psychologist, back in the 80s. Does anyone remember Leo Buscaglia, the love guy? Leo gave this great example demonstrating our negativity bias. Negativity is much more highly processed by our brains than anything positive that happens. And he talked about how you could go through the entire day getting compliments. People coming up to you, oh, I loved your talk. Oh, your suit is so tasteful. Your hair looks great. You're so funny. But then the one person who comes up to you and says, I don't want to tell you, but you really smell bad. You know, we remember that. And the psychologist John Gottman, he studies marriage and how couples communicate. And he talks about how you need a 6-to-1 ratio. So you've got to hear at least 6 positive things from your spouse, because that one negative thing is the one that's going to get you in trouble. Now let's think about our kids' school day. Their little punishment circuit is the one that's going to override the pleasure circuit. The pleasure of reading Frog and Toad Are Friends is not as strong for a lot of our dyslexic kids as the pain and anguish and shame and boredom they're going to feel trying to sound out all of those words and read the text. So we don't understand a lot of times when we do something that we think our kids should like, or we try to set it up so that our kids will like an activity, and they're refusing and they don't want to do it, and we're trying to move mountains to get them to actually give it a try. So this is little Albert. Back in the golden days of psychology, they used to abuse the heck out of people and animals and pretty much anyone they could get their hands on. Now we only abuse medical students and psychology undergrads. Much better. So you know about little Albert. Basically, psychologist John Watson takes little Albert, because his mother was kind of a low-status wet nurse and he could mess with her baby. Takes little Albert and scares this poor baby. Shows him like a white, fluffy, all kinds of white, fluffy objects. A white rat, a Santa Claus beard, and makes this really horrible, loud noise every time he does it. So the baby's conditioned to have a fear response to things that are totally innocuous. You know, now he even fears Santa Claus. Great work, John. So this poor little baby, anything white and fluffy, baby freaks out. This is a conditioned response, but it's something to be aware of when we think about how our kids react when we give them tasks. Because for a lot of the kids who come to places like this, the wounded ducks, they've been learning all of these years that the things they do in school are painful and unpleasant and boring and make them feel ashamed and bad. And unlearning that kind of information is much harder than learning positivity. So when a kid comes to a place like this, there's a huge task ahead of those teachers, because unlearning that, the brain holds on to the bad things that have happened to us. It doesn't want bad things to happen to us. I don't want to get an electric shock or be scared with John Watson banging heavy pipes. So we learn to avoid that. A lot of times kids who avoid things are called lazy. Avoiding something unpleasant is very human. It makes total sense. If I tell you I'm going to taser you and you run away, when you're like, she's so unmotivated, I just can't get her to sit still. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that helps a lot with memory. And the important thing to remember about memory, it's not, as Steven Pinker says, it's not just a nice feature that got stuck into the brain so that we would have fun scrapbooking. Memory is not about so much remembering the past as it is anticipating the future. And so again, with our kids, if they've learned that every time that math workbook comes out, their day is going to get a little bit worse, they're going to anticipate again in the future that every time that math book comes out, the day is going to get a little bit worse, they're not going to do well. And then you have the behavioral inhibition system. This was actually an ad for a dentist. I don't know what he was thinking, because this guy looks terrified to me, so I love this picture. Fight or flight, we all hear about when we're afraid of something or when something bad is going to happen to us. The stress response starts up, our sympathetic nervous system gets all activated, we're ready to either fight somebody or run away. How often can we do that? We're not being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, we're having to sit through a spelling test, or we're having to read, the 5 chapters of the Grapes of Wrath. Our behavioral inhibition system takes over when we just have to sit there and take it. You go to the dentist, gynecologist, oh my God. But for a lot of kids, school is like this. And the thing to know about our behavioral inhibition system is it's very costly to our brains. There's a phenomenon in our brains called ego depletion. And this is that feeling that you had kind of constantly after your first child was born, where you were walking around like, oh God, can I get through the day? Basically, it's when our brain has had to work too hard for too long a time, and we actually do get depleted. Just like muscles can get depleted, our brain can get depleted and needs a chance to refuel and recover. And so, when we have conflict in ourselves, that is very stressful. It takes a lot of work, and over time, it's very bad for us. Bill talked about meditation and how we need to lower our stress levels, because our kids, if you think about elementary school, they're spending most of their day in this kind of a state. And it's bad for their hippocampus, it's bad for their adrenal system, it's bad for your heart. Not to be totally gloom and doom here, but this is really, really not a healthy state to be in. And so chronic stress is something we can pay a lot of attention to. So remember, memory is allowing us to predict the future. So again, with our kids, a lot of their motivation decisions that they make, that we say, what the heck? I've set everything up for you. It should be perfectly obvious that you need to spend 2 hours studying geography. Our kids are making a rational choice when they decide to try and get out of it. It's not necessarily the best choice, but we have to understand that behavior never comes without reason. There's a reason they're doing that. And a lot of times it's because of what they've learned. So in terms of behaviors, you can either approach something, you can go to a task, or seek it out, or you can avoid it. And again, the most stressful thing for our body is when we can't do anything at all, when we're just stuck there in Algebra 2 for an hour every single day, when we want to be doing something else. And so our brains have to decide how they're going to respond. And this is where a lot of our kids find themselves getting into trouble. Because what do we as humans do when things start to get boring or unpleasant? We try to find a way to get out of it. And a lot of our kids do. And this is where we get our behavior problem kids, our lazy kids, our oppositional kids, our resistant kids. What we have to remember as the adults in the room is that these behaviors are happening for a reason, generally a really good reason. If you can get the child to articulate after their stress, of course, or after their stress has gone down, if you can get your kid to talk about what's going on, you probably will find out that this was a logical decision on their part. So we all have goals. We have goals that our brain wants us to do, the absolutely imperative things. We have to drink water, we have to eat food, we have to sleep. Remember again, when you had an infant, it was very hard to achieve any of these goals on a regular basis, and so that was stressful. Gazzaniga, the neuroscientist, says goals exist within a hierarchy, and I love that idea. It sounds so simple, but when we think about how do we decide what to do at any point, we have all these competing goals. So imagine you're down at the National Mall, crowded day, some sort of festival in August. You thought it would be a great idea to bring your toddler to it. You're standing in a 20-minute line waiting for a $5 bottle of water because you're so thirsty you think you're going to die. All of a sudden, your toddler sees a mounted police, bam, goes right off after to pet the horsey. You're not going to stand in line and be like, yeah, I'll get him after I get a drink because I'm so thirsty. Your amygdala is going to kick in, your stress response is going to kick in, you're going to jump right out of that line, thirsty as you are, and go get your toddler. And so we always are mixing it up. We're trying to figure out which goals are the most important to satisfy at any one time. And sometimes it's stressful. This pyramid is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Anyone know Maslow? Okay, great. So Abraham Maslow was a psychologist, and he basically felt that you couldn't get to the higher level sorts of needs the things like being happy, being at peace, being intellectually productive, being kind to others, unless the other needs were first satisfied. So if you don't have enough to eat, you're not going to really be able to learn higher order math, was the idea. But the important one to pay attention to with our kids is those ones in the middle. Because our kids, bless them, they have enough to eat. They have warm clothes. They have rooms full of toys they're not playing with. So we're paying attention to the middle section where we're talking about their need to feel safe, their need to feel accepted by others, and their need to feel competent. If those three pieces aren't there, how far are we really going to get trying to teach them to read, trying to teach them to sit still, trying to teach them to do complicated tasks that require a lot of work? So now we get to the psychology of motivation. And there have been a lot of theories about what motivates us over time. So the first one, we had Freud back in the day. I went to a psychoanalytically oriented graduate program. We read a lot of Freud. So Freud's whole idea is that there's pleasure and then there's unpleasure, and that the body has drives. We all have these aggressive drives, these lust-filled drives. And what our job is we want to try to satisfy those drives as best we can without getting thrown in jail or having our spouse leave us or having somebody punch us in the face. It's kind of Freud in a nutshell. So people improved upon this, and then we had the stage theorists. These are people like Erikson, Kohlberg, Harold Gilligan, Piaget. I'm taking you back to Psych 101. And these folks argued that it wasn't just about what Freud was talking about with the pleasure versus unpleasure, was that our motivation is determined a lot by where we are in our developmental tasks. Certainly a toddler is tremendously motivated to acquire language. They go through periods called word hunger, where they're acquiring like 10 words a day. Not the same for teenagers. They're motivated to seek novelty, they're motivated to separate from you, they're motivated to get ready to leave the nest. Entirely appropriate. My 5-year-old started crying the other night because he hadn't quite realized that my stepson lives at college. And so when he found that out, I don't know where he thought my stepson was. He's been at college for 3 years. But he started sobbing, and he says, "Mommy, I don't ever want to go live at college." And I'm, "That's right, sweetie. You don't. You want to stay with me." But you know, when he's 18, is he still going to be crying on my shoulder and saying, "Please don't send me to college"? Seems unlikely. So this was all about where are you in your development. So right now, most of us, we want to be professionally successful. Most of us really fantasize about the chance to sleep in these days. And then the behaviorists. This is John Watson and B.F. Skinner. The folks who like to, say, take an animal, starve it down to 80% of its body weight and get it to peck things repeatedly in exchange for like a little pellet of food. But John Watson argued that if you were to give him a baby, that he could basically shape that baby through behavioral means and turn it into a laborer, a doctor, a scientist, basically anything you wanted through behavioral means. And we know that's not really the case because each person brings a lot to the table genetically as well. But there's still that idea of if we just set up the reward and punishment contingencies for children, that we can get them to do what we want. And if a child's not responding to that, oh, there's something wrong with the child. And then evolutionary psychology is wonderful because folks like Steven Pinker and some of these social scientists have great sort of just so stories. Oh, Elizabeth Hurley got cheated on because cavemen had to spread more of their genetic material around. Hugh Grant was just acting out of biological necessity. Okay. But they have a lot of wonderful ideas about how our brain evolved and what we're designed for. So that idea was that we're motivated to do things that would have helped us survive way back when we were hunters and gatherers on the African savanna. But then there's something really cool that you might not have heard of, which is behavioral economics. How many people have heard of behavioral economics? All right. So I have something new. Behavioral economics, the one psychologist that I know of who won the Nobel Prize did not win it for psychology, he won it for economics, because that's a full Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name, won the Nobel Prize for coming up with prospect theory. And prospect theory takes us away from the idea that we're all very rational thinkers. If I offer you $1,000, you'll go and do something that I want. If I produce a laundry detergent that costs less and work better, you'll all run out and buy it. So Kahneman's idea is that no. People don't act in completely rational ways, at least not in ways we would perceive as being entirely rational. People make decisions based on the psychological value of whatever the outcome of the choice might be. So we'll talk more about that, because prospect theory is really interesting when you, at least to me, when you think about why won't my kid do what I want. So intrinsic motivation. These people are the go-getters. They go and they do, and they don't need anybody waving a carrot in front of their face. I think you all are old enough to have watched Scooby-Doo with me back in the day. We've got Feynman, Einstein, and all this. But then there's extrinsic motivation. And this is when you need a little something to get you going. So if you remember Scooby-Doo, Velma was constantly bribing Scooby and Shaggy with Scooby snacks. So when you think of that in terms of behavior theory, there was the antecedent. Shaggy and Scooby were being chased by a zombie. Fred built a trap. Shaggy and Scooby were the bait. They had to lure the zombie into the trap. And of course, the behavior would be leading the zombie into the trap, and the consequence would be not that they were going to be eaten by the zombie, but they were going to get Scooby snacks if they accomplished this. And we know this doesn't always work. Self-efficacy is the sense of personal agency, the sense that you're competent enough to do something. And we know with our kids with learning disabilities, they don't feel like the little choo-choo train very often. Put me back in Algebra 2, I'm not going to feel like the little choo-choo train. You put me in a literature class, I'm going to feel awesome. But that's going to impact my motivation to work hard on either of those two tasks. And learned helplessness, if you remember from Psych 100, again, back in the golden age of psychology experiments, they took a bunch of dogs, put them in this room that was divided by a panel. They put the dogs on this electric shock floor, and these poor dogs keep getting shocked. And the dogs eventually learn, like, there's nothing they can do about this, so they just sit there and take it. So this is what a lot of our kids' school day is kind of like. They're like the dog, and there's just no way to escape it. And what they found was that even if you open a door into another room where the dog could get up and walk away and not feel shocks anymore, dogs didn't actually do it. They just cowered in the corner. If you've ever read Viktor Frankl, he writes about, in Mankind's Search for Meaning, he writes about his time in a concentration camp. And he writes about when you have people who can't do anything about their situation, they develop a sense of profound apathy. And it's the same sort of thing, whether you're a dog, whether you're human, whether you're a little kid in second grade and everyone else is reading and you're not. Okay, so why can't I get my kid to do what I want? It's obvious that if he studies, he'll go to a good college. Everyone will be proud of him. If he studies, he'll get an A. If he studies, I might get him a car. We think we've set everything up so that it should be perfectly obvious that our children will make the rational decision and do whatever it is we want them to do. Well, we know that's not the way it goes, because our kids are weighting outcomes and decisions with a different set of values than we are. One of the things kids tend to value more than we do is what they can have right in the moment. And you know this for teenagers especially. We do this too. How many people have put as much as they should into their 401k? Yeah, not too many, right? How many of us, while we're eating the piece of cake, are as focused on the fact that, hey, I've got a wedding to go to and I'm not going to buy a new dress, so I need to fit, maybe not you, not the dress thing, but your suit pants. I got to fit into that, so it might not be such a great idea to have an extra slice of cake right now. But we don't weigh the long term very well. We tend to focus on what's happening right now. So a lot of us are much more likely to go down to DSW Shoe Warehouse and blow $150 on a pair of boots that we really should have been putting into our 401k. But that's so far in the future. We're not really good at thinking about that. And kids in particular are not really good at thinking about the long-term goal. Even the long-term goal that's like 10 minutes down the road versus the one that's right here and now of, I want to play my Wii and I don't want to study. So this is the, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, which I hope is obvious. Okay. Angela Duckworth is a psychologist, and she won a MacArthur Genius Grant this year, which is very exciting for those of us in psychology, because not many psychologists do research that people like the MacArthur Fellowship group are very much interested in. And even less so when you have somebody that actually studies real kids as opposed to rat brains or how snails learn to avoid electric shocks, that kind of thing. So what Duckworth studies is grit. She studies determination and passion. And what she's saying here, which I think she said so much more beautifully than I can say, is that when we make a decision to give up, it's a rational decision. We have very good reasons for that. And particularly because we somehow feel like we lose value for the goal. The goal is not what's motivating us anymore. So when we talk about barriers to motivation, what gets in the way? And the first thing, of course, we have to look at is context. So I see a lot of kids from middle schools, like Bill talked about, that are starting to refuse school. And the context there, it might be that they're not making friends, but it might really be that they were in the soft nest of elementary school for a while, and then they get to middle school, and all those nice supports are taken away, and all of a sudden, wow, I hate school. So there was a scientist named Vygotsky, and he talked about how instruction has to fall within our zone of proximal development. It's got to hit us where it's just hard enough that we need a little bit of help to get there, but not so hard that we're completely overwhelmed, and not too easy that we're not all that interested. And that's the essence of a really good school and a really good teacher, is they have that internal sense of how to work in a kid's zone of proximal development. So then there's also interpersonal barriers, obviously. And one of the things we do a lot as parents, and we kind of can't help it, is we cast our children in roles. And you find, I think, a lot, the previous generation did this even more. But all of these things lock our kids into a certain way of being. And they get reinforced for it, whether we mean to or not. Stop being such a crybaby. Or, maybe our kid is, one of those kids who cries very easily, and every time we come running, oh, sweetie, sweetie, mama's here, mama's here, mama's here. We're reinforcing them. It's very hard for kids, once they've gotten into a role and once they see themselves in a particular role, it's really hard for them to trust that they could break out of it or even see that it's possible to be anything different. Okay, so then there's more interpersonal barriers and social pressures. J.K. Rowling did a wonderful commencement talk at Harvard University, and her talk was all about failure, the whole thing. And basically she was telling the graduating class of Harvard that they need to change how they see failure, not as something to be avoided at all costs, but something to be embraced. If you remember, J.K. Rowling was like, the famous story is she was on welfare when she wrote Harry Potter on some napkins, and now she's this wonderful, beloved billionaire. More power to her, I think that's great. So one of the things that we do to our kids, a lot of us in this area are really successful. I can't tell you how many parents come to see me and they're both corporate attorneys or they're both surgeons, and their kid is struggling to learn to read. And so in the context of their family culture, being different like that throws everybody for a loop. And so we have to think about how we're perceiving what is actually failure for our kids versus what is something that's going to require us to see things a little bit differently. Okay. Nobody raise your hand. Nobody call out. Okay. Sarah, which line is the longest?
Number 1.
Excellent. Wow. That's terrific. And now, Sarah, why did you say number 1?
Because you told me to.
Yes, I did. So everybody looked at this. Your brain had perfectly good visual perception. It said to you, number 3 is the right one. And then I set up a conflict in your mind, because when you heard Sarah say that and me praise her, everyone was like, wait a minute, is she tricking us? How did Sarah get that? And the fact is that Sarah was willing to go along with that just because I'm the person in the front of the room with the clicker. So there's a lot of social pressure there to do things a certain way. Ash, back in the 1950s, he did these experiments where he brought in a whole bunch of people and he would have everyone in the room swear to God that line 1 was the longest line, and they'd bring in the one poor person, like say we brought in Paul, and Paul's not in on the joke of the experiment, and all these people saying, yes, definitely line 1. And you can watch the videotapes of these people, they're like, what? And then, how can this be? But eventually, Paul, most likely, would be starting to say, yes, I see it now, line 1. Line 1's definitely the longest. What our kids decide to do is very influenced by what the other kids around them are doing, what we tell them to do. If our kids get the idea, for example, that girls aren't good at math, or boys aren't good at reading, or girls aren't good at science, or, boys can't learn as good as girls, so you might as well goof off anyway. There's a lot of social pressure there, and that reinforces for them plugging themselves into a role that they can't get out of. Particularly when you have a kid in a classroom where there's a teacher bias, and having been a teacher, I understand how this happens. You sort of get a sense of which kids are going to be the ones who, when you ask the question, are going to raise their hands, they're going to get it fast, and then you have the other kids. And maybe you have that one kid in the class who you know is probably not getting most anything of what you're trying to teach. And you treat those children differently. Try not to, but it comes through. So if I know that Sarah always gets the right answer, when I call on Sarah, it's going to be very different versus, I'm going to pick on you if you don't mind, if I know that Bernie never really gets anything right, and calling on Bernie is probably not going to be a great experience, I'm not going to interact with Bernie probably as much at all, and I'm certainly not going to give her a lot of opportunities for praise and for all the warm, good cuddlies that should come with having an elementary school teacher. And then there's praise and rewards. There's ways to praise that kill off motivation, and there's ways to praise that motivate kids, and we're going to talk about that. One of the things that Deci found is if you reward kids for things they would be doing anyway, their motivation goes doop, 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 doop. So one of the things we want to be really careful with is deciding how to use our rewards in ways that will actually increase motivation rather than kill it off, or even worse, satiate our kids on needing to feel like they're going to get a reward for every single thing, and then asking for more reward and more reward and more reward. And again, as parents, we unwittingly reinforce the undesirable behavior. We do this all the time. I know I do too. And so this is why you come to a psychologist and you say, help, I can't figure out what's going on. Why won't my kid do what I want? And the psychologist says, oh, you're reinforcing the behavior you don't want. Here, do it this differently. Hopefully. And in terms of some of the barriers to motivation that we don't often think about with our kids is really body questions. If you've ever been in a 12-step program, don't raise your hands. One of the strategies that you used to avoid a relapse is HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Nobody's motivated when they're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. So a lot of times with our kids, the real problem in getting them motivated is feed them a snack or let them move their bodies. It's funny now because with the public schools offering so little PE time, we're now paying tuition to give our kids more recess time, which if you told me that would happen back in the early 90s, I would have been like, you're crazy. But we see the value now. And for teens, they've got to have a high level of stimulation. We can't expect our teenagers just to sit still and do all these worksheets. There's little Miley Cyrus, who could be a whole topic herself. But the developmental stage is really what's important. So you remember when Miley Cyrus was this cute little wholesome girl, and now she's twerking. The developmental stage is going to determine what she's going to want to do. And by the time she's 40, hopefully she won't be doing that anymore. It's important to note that physical maturity doesn't always match cognitive maturity. So for some of our kids who are early bloomers or who are very tall, we often expect them to be more mature and more focused and better able to do things, and we're kind of rough with them if they actually can't. Whereas the kids who look young get a little bit of a break, where we don't have the same set of expectations for them, for better or for worse. But a lot of it has to come down to what we believe about ourselves. So if we believe that we are bad at math and we will always be bad at math, or we're bad at reading and we will never be good at it, there's no motivation there. And again, Kahneman's prospect theory is an important thing to think about, when we think about that, so again, just to back it up, I know you guys have been sitting now for like 2 hours. With prospect theory, there was the idea in economics that consumers behaved rationally. Everyone made decisions based on a cost-benefit analysis. Do I buy a car this year? Do I buy a car next year? Do the math, figure it out, buy car A or car B. And of course, Kahneman gets the Nobel Prize for figuring out, like, hey, people don't make decisions like that. There's two main ways we make decisions. The first way is with what he calls System 1. This is the snap judgment part of our brain. We use this all the time. Remember, our brain's inherently kind of lazy. Our brain inherently wants to do stuff that doesn't take a lot of effort. So if I can make a snap decision about something, I'm going to do it pretty much all the time. But if there's a conflict and if there's a problem-solving task, what's 27 times 42? Whoa, okay, I've got to actually think about that one versus 1 plus 1, 2. So System 1 does the easy problem-solving task. System 2 does the complicated problem-solving task. What has this got to do with motivating our kids? The trick is to get our kids accustomed to the idea that they can do deep thinking about things instead of making these snap judgments, and that that's okay, and even though it takes a lot more effort, it's worth it. And of course, our level of insight, Luke Skywalker did not have a very good level of insight, thinking he could fight Darth Vader. You know this. And so we want our kids to have that level of insight, not that comes from the outside. Bobby, you're bad at math. Susie, you're good at Spanish. They have to evolve over time without getting locked into a specific role, so that they really can figure out, am I good at this? Am I not? Could I try this? But another problem is that we often don't cope very well. Our kids don't tend to have great ways of coping with frustration. So if you have a kid who's prone to meltdowns, we see a lot of these kids. First grade goes okay, second grade not quite as well, third grade, oh my God. All of a sudden, the work turns into the type of tasks that they're the worst at. The frustration has been building over time. The hurt feelings, the shame, all of it. And you get to the point where the kid cannot cope anymore, and they're having meltdowns, and then you have to pay someone like me to come in and solve the problem. So motivation, being able to persevere with things, it really depends on how well you can cope with all of the just sort of nasty stuff that life is going to throw at you. So what are the foundations of motivation? It's not so much just that you're thinking about a reward. We think about motivation, oh, my kid has goals. But this is what's really all about, the unsexy things. Just plain old perseverance, being willing to try again, being willing to fail, being willing to tolerate it when things are boring or frustrating. And that's where it's at for our kids. Because let's face it, the elementary school, middle school, high school years, you have no choice over how you're spending your time all day. You got to be good at whatever it is the teacher's handing out to you. And if you can make it to grad school, you can start studying the stuff that you actually wanted to study in the first place, the stuff you're good at. But until then, you've got to tolerate doing things whether you're good at them or not good at them, whether you like them, whether you don't, 6 hours a day, however many weeks in a year, and that gets a lot of our kids down. We also kind of sell our kids on the idea that everything has to be fun. And so, of course, Calvin is the great canonical example. If you can't read it, Mom says, Calvin, would you set the table for me, please? Yeah, I don't think so. I'm not enthusiastic about setting the table. And there's Mom's face, which is like my face 90% of the time. I don't think you should have to do something unless you're enthusiastic about it. My kids have given me this little talk before, and they haven't liked my answers too well. Because this is the real deal. Here's Wesley from The Princess Bride. We all need an excuse to look at Wesley. This is true. Life is pain. Life is boring tasks. Life is wiping a 5-year-old's backside in a portable toilet at the pumpkin patch. That's what it's all about. Anyone who tries to sell us differently, or anyone who says differently is selling something. And I was given a framed picture of this when I got my master's degree. It says, defeat. For every winner, there are dozens of losers. Odds are you're one of them. That was wonderful. And kind of true. In every race, in every class, there's somebody who is going to be the best. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all the rest of these folks running whatever it is they're running are wasting their time. For people who run marathons, God bless you, you're not generally running because you think you're actually going to win. You're running for the experience of what it's doing for you and the challenge for you. If the only reason to run a marathon or to try hard on a test was because you feel like you're going to win or you're going to be the best, not many of us would be very motivated to do something. And how do we get our kids motivating themselves? One of the things to really think about is we all have a legacy of shame. Isn't that cheerful? But we do. We have a lot of things that happened to us when we were little kids, and big kids and teenagers especially. Those moments that we look back on and we cringe, those moments when we disappointed our parents, those moments when we weren't good enough, when my father got my standardized test scores back and my reading was really, really good and my spatial relations was bad, shall we say, and he, instead of talking about how good my reading scores were, he's like, well, I can see you're never going to be a dentist. Oh, okay. I always remembered that because, again, I have a negativity bias. I don't remember my mom saying, oh, you did so well in reading. I remember my dad being like, okay, you're obviously not good enough to take over my practice someday. And that's all right. I don't want to be a dentist, so all good. But part of why we get upset with our kids is they do stuff that we know we got dinged for, or we got judged for, or we got in trouble for when we were little. And so a lot of times we want to spare our kids this pain. And there's a lot of times when your family members are over and your sister's bragging about all the great stuff her kids are doing. And yes, well, he's 3 years old and he's speaking Mandarin and reading Harry Potter. We just can't get him to slow down. I'm looking at special schools for my son. And then, of course, we got our in-laws. And parenting becomes amazingly easier, I think, when you hit about 65. And then you forget all the hard stuff that you had to go through and all the pain in the neck stuff your kids put you through. And it's like, well, my children never did that. Okay, mother-in-law. But we have this legacy, and so a lot of the things our kids doing aren't so much about our kids in terms of how they make us feel, but they're really more about us. Oh my God, I don't want him to be bad at math. Oh, I don't want him to be bullied. I don't want him to go through what I went through. So a lot of times the emotional reaction we have when our kids aren't successful, not so much to do with just the kids, but a lot more to do with us and our own battle scars. So we can choose to be authoritarian, scream at our children, and be a tiger mom and all of that. And if I do things like that to you, if I come up to Flo and I start screaming and hit her in the head with a baseball bat or do all sorts of intimidating, terrible things, I can probably get Flo to do a lot of what I want. She's going to hate me, though. And as soon as I'm gone, she's not going to keep doing the things that I wanted her to do. But if I nurture her and help her, pretending you're a kid now, obviously, so make her feel good about herself, when I leave the room, I know she's probably going to keep doing the stuff that I taught her to do. So yeah, we can get results with these things, but are they lasting results, and do they actually change our kids, make them into the kind of people we want them to be? Not so much. We all hear a lot about helicopter parenting now. We moms love to beat ourselves up. Like everything on HuffPo that I get now that comes through my Facebook feed. You need to be parenting like the French. You're a helicopter parent. You need to parent like Amy Chua, the tiger mom. You're a helicopter mom. Your kids are all terrible. Kids 50 years ago were awesome and your kids suck. Excuse me for saying it that way. And yeah, our kids do need to solve their own problems, but I would encourage you to take this with a grain of salt because there's a lot of times where it is appropriate to get more involved in our children's lives, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're a helicopter parent. Maybe your kid needs some help. And this idea that our kids nowadays are such total losers and can't do anything for themselves, just remember about the past. If it was so great, it wouldn't have changed. So keep an open mind there. But the important thing is yes, our kids need to experience challenge, conflict, failure. They need to have those situations where they know that they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and they did it just by their own grit. Because I'm a big believer in these two principles. Psychologists claim Gnat. People have corrected me every single time. I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced because it's an Israeli name. I think it's Gnat. And Ross Green, if you've ever heard of the collaborative problem-solving approach, fantastic. Our kids are trying to do well. We have to keep that in mind. Nobody wants to be the lazy kid. Nobody wants to be the kid who can't read. Nobody wants to be the kid that the teacher hates to see having a meltdown. That's not what they want. You know, if they could be the kid who would sit down and effortlessly do wonderful and have everyone, Sarah, you're terrific, let me give you a trophy. We'd all do that if we could. Those were my little monkeys. And so part of what helps our kids feel motivated is that they're in charge. And so if you take a look at, Ross Green has a website called Lives in the Balance. If you ever get to see him speak, he's a wonderful speaker. And I had a resource sheet that I can have emailed to you. I sent it on to Susan. It didn't get printed up, but that's okay. Helping kids find their own solutions. A lot of times we come in, we're feeling anxious, oh my God, the spelling test is coming, and you haven't even started on that, and you've got your math packet to do, and you've got to build a colonial house before Tuesday. We often tell the kids, well, here's what you should do. And we're a lot more motivated if people come to us and say, well, what do you think you should do? And that's what's kind of annoying about psychologists, right? How do you feel about that? What do you think you might do in that situation? Is it, come on, I'm paying you, just tell me the answer. We got to encourage our kids to take risks, not the kind where they ride a motorcycle over a ditch, but the kind where maybe they raise their hand in math class. Maybe they try out for science fair or the school play. Maybe they call someone up for a play date who they didn't think would probably actually want to play with them. We can't take away their hope, and we do a lot of time do that. I don't know if you're going to, you're so shy. How are you going to be in the play, honey? How are you going to memorize your lines with your dyslexia? How's that going to work out for you? We need to let them do that and encourage them that it's okay if they do it and it doesn't work out, because they're going to learn something from that. And one of the things that kids really do is they see the forest and all the trees whenever they've got a problem to solve, and they don't know how to break it up into chunks. That's what special ed is really kind of all about at its core, is taking a great, big, complicated task and breaking it down into small, manageable, absorbable pieces. But our kids have a hard time with that, particularly our kids with learning differences. And helping them to reflect, if something didn't go so well, instead of telling them, well, yeah, you failed the spelling test because you didn't actually study. Duh! We need to say something to them that is helpful. We say that to our spouse behind the closed door. But we say to our kids something like, well, what do you think happened there? Usually our kids will kind of say, I don't know. Well, I don't know. Do you think you studied enough? Maybe not. Do you think you should have gone to the mall with Cheryl? Yeah, that probably wasn't such a good idea. Reflecting on things is really important. How to praise. Gammons and Dweck have published on person versus process praise. Person praise. Kathleen, you are fabulous. You're just the best at this, and I think you're so great and so smart and so terrific. So I'm praising Kathleen as a person, versus if I say to Kathleen, Kathleen, you studied for 2 hours last night. It's terrific. Very different sort of thing. The first level of praise, Kathleen's like, where are you going with this? You don't even know me. Why am I awesome? Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I'm just happy it wasn't mine. And look, we're all parents here. Most of us are kids or with our spouse, and we're going to get those calls. Honey, I can't find the cleats. Where the heck are they? So it's fine.
This might not be.
No problem. So yeah, what we really need to praise is what our kids do. And we need to praise the attributes that they're showing, the judgment that they're making. Hey, you chose to study instead of going to the mall. I'm really impressed. hey, you brushed your teeth instead of playing with your plastic shark. That's my house. Hey, you hung up your coat instead of throwing it on the floor. Thank God. So you never want to tell kids things like, you are so smart, you can totally do this. Because our kids' internal reaction is, I'm not smart enough to do this because it's hard. If I was smart enough to do this, it wouldn't feel hard. So Mom, you don't know what you're talking about. And again, I'm Ganot. I'm just going to say Ganot. Back in the 60s, he talked about the power of praise. He talked about it as in praise is a potent medication. You don't use it all the time, like penicillin. You don't get penicillin all the time, but you use it when you really need to use it. So we do a lot of throwaway praise because we love our kids. They're awesome. They make us happy. But when we're really getting serious about getting them motivated, we got to praise the motivation-oriented behaviors. The sitting still, the persevering, the going to class, the studying, the being willing to meet with the tutor, the giving up going to the mall. All of those kinds of behaviors is what we need to focus on. This works really good with our spouses too. We're both John Gottman fans at our house, and John Gottman is the psychologist that studied what makes marriage work. And so yeah, difference between giving a criticism versus making a complaint. And helping your child break out of a role, this is so tough, especially if you've got the wounded duck. And here I am using the role of the wounded duck to illustrate this point about the wounded duck. But if your kid feels like a loser, or your kid feels like a Charlie Brown, we gotta help them understand that change is not easy. What we say to them is, this is so easy. Come on, you can do this. This is not that hard. Well, we need to respect the child's struggle and understand that, yeah, it is that hard. And it was that hard for you when you were the 5-year-old who was trying to tie your shoes when everyone's saying to you, get back in the soccer game as fast as you can. Change is not easy at all. And so just like Wesley says to Buttercup, life is pain, sometimes we have to help our children understand that, yeah, this is hard. You're going to have to work hard on this, and you're going to have to keep practicing this. This isn't going to come easy. A lot of us feel like we discourage our kids if we say that to them, but you'll actually find if you do acknowledge that, your kid will probably be more willing to try than if you say to them, Beth, you're so smart, you could do this. Come on, Beth, just focus. I mean, Beth, seriously, I saw you do way harder stuff than this. Can you just focus on this, please? It's due tomorrow. Beth's thinking, oh, how can I get away from her? And giving constructive feedback. So feedback, okay. So I know I was supposed to stop at 11:15, but I know we're a little bit over. So should I be flicking through this as fast as possible and end in 1 minute? Okay. I promised you I wouldn't run over, and then I did. The difference here is making a criticism versus a complaint. Criticism, you're so lazy, I can't believe you're such a slob, this room is a pigsty, versus a complaint. And my husband and I do this all the time. Honey, the trash is still in the trash can and it's overflowing. Oops. Versus, can we get a clean house for once? Would it kill you to take the trash out? Just pointing things out to our kids is really important. And we want to avoid the absolutes, you always, you never. These kill off motivation. Because if I always disappoint you, where's my motivation to do any better? And again, our attitude towards mistakes, we got to be positive about mistakes with our kids, because it's not that we're going to say that was okay to make that choice, but we're going to learn from it and we're going to get better next time. And there's Kahneman, true intuitive expertise is learned from prolonged experience with good feedback on mistakes. Remember the humiliation of grad school, if you ever went, that's what it's all about. Making mistakes, getting them corrected. So we're out of time. Unfortunately, I had about 5 more minutes worth of stuff. But you're going to get a packet with this, and this is the MacArthur Fellow I was telling you about, Angela Duckworth up at UPenn with Seligman. She's done a lot of work on grit, and she's actually published an instrument called the Grit S, like Kiss My Grits, the grit scale, where you can assess your own grit. And in terms of thinking about Angela Duckworth, Angela has done a lot of wonderful work here. She's determined that grit matters more than IQ in a lot of situations. And she believes that pretty soon she's going to come out with ways that we can start actively teaching our kids to have grit. Then genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And of course, as some cynics will point out, yeah, but if you don't have the 1%, you're left with a big bucket of sweat. All right. So hopefully get your packet, and that's it. Thank you so much for coming in.